Hello, my name is Matthew Carmona and I'm a professor at the Bartlett UCL, where over many years I've been engaged in the teaching and research of urban design. This talk introduces the third edition of Public Places, Urban Spaces, the Dimensions of Urban Design, a book that marks the continuing evolution of the discipline of urban design, as well as of my own academic career, and which has just been published by Routledge. In doing so, I will highlight some of the changes that we've seen in the discipline itself, which are reflected in turn in the book. Now, the primary motivation for the book derived from a period between 1995 and 1998, when I worked as a young lecturer at the University of Nottingham. This is me then. I still had brown hair and certainly more of it than I have now. At the time, I was asked to teach a new urban design theory module, and looking around, it seemed to me that there were no books that offered in one place a clear and logical route map through the growing knowledge about urban design. Consequently, and perhaps rather rashly, I resolved to write one. Over the course of my first year at Nottingham, the lectures that I produced and taught, with some rather dodgy slides very often, provided the structure and the early content for the book, all heavily influenced by the literature that I was reviewing at the time for my own doctorate. Now, being distracted somewhat by the PhD, it actually took until 2003, by which time I was at UCL, for the first edition of the book to be finished and published, following invaluable contributions from fellow authors Steve Teasdale, Tim Heath and Tanner Rock. All three editions have at their core a determination to provide a comprehensive overview of the subject, encompassing all the important areas of urban design scholarship. Although I have to confess that this has become progressively harder to achieve over the years. The first edition of Public Places, Urban Spaces was limited by the knowledge at our disposal in a world still on the verge of an information revolution. It was at Nottingham that I had my first computer, at least my first computer that could properly surf the web, and it looked like this. But even though I had something to surf the web on, the online information on urban design was very sparse indeed. Dedicated academic journals on the subject were very much in their infancy, and the choice of books was still quite limited, as I should say was my own experience of large parts of the world at that time. By 2010, when the second edition was published, things had of course changed, and Steve Teasdale and I worked closely together on updating the book in the context of what by then was really a burgeoning subject as regards journals and programs of study, online resources, and general interest in the discipline. Reflecting this, we began working on the second edition just 5 years after publication of the first. Although looking back on that edition, whilst I was regularly travelling beyond the West by then, the book overwhelmingly remained embedded in a Western perspective on urban design. The third edition had to wait almost a decade before I began work on it. In part, that reflected Steve's tragically early death, just a year after the publication of the second edition, and my uncertainty at the time about whether I wished to continue the journey without my old friend and colleague. It also reflected the enormity of the task, which of course only got bigger as the years passed by. Research shows, for example, that the size of the global datasphere grew from 9.5 trillion gigabytes worldwide in 2008 to an estimated 163 trillion gigabytes by 2025. If urban design reflects this exponential growth, which entirely unscientifically I can absolutely confirm that it does, then any systematic and synthesizing overview of the discipline becomes progressively more challenging to achieve. In 2017, faced with the mountain of published books, articles, online resources and other materials piled up for inclusion in the new edition, I have to confess that it almost made me turn tail and run. But fortunately I didn't, and over 3 years I gradually ploughed through the material in order to create edition number 3. Something of this growth in urban design knowledge can be seen in the physical growth of the book itself, from 312 pages when first published to 672 pages today. There was quite simply a more complex, layered, and far more international literature from which to draw. Also reflected in the growth of source references in the various editions of the book, and the growth in illustrations. Today, almost 1,000 illustrations have been carefully chosen in order to deliberately capture the diversity of international contexts and experiences which mould the different approaches to urban design. One side effect of this is that whilst the discipline remains firmly embedded in the formative and Western contributions of its founding mothers and fathers, the likes of Jane Jacobs and Kevin Lynch and Gordon Cullen and Christopher Alexander, their significance is also reducing in an ever more sophisticated and nuanced set of understandings and analyses from around the world. As a maturing discipline, this knowledge is derived from a combination of theoretical exploration, empirical evidence, and reflective practice. So whilst wishing to see the book continue, I also needed to acknowledge that the 3rd edition was not, indeed could never be, simply business as usual. With the passing of Steve, a chapter had closed, and I felt that the new edition had to be something different from the last ones. At this point then, particular thanks is certainly due to Tanarok, Tim Heath, and particularly and posthumously to Steve Teasdale for their contributions to the journey thus far. With this as a backdrop, I decided to embark on a more radical restructuring of the book than otherwise I might have contemplated. The original structure of the book, which had its origins, as I said, in my PhD, in fact proved to be remarkably robust. Indeed, I've delivered a lecture course every year since 1996 based on the notion of 6 substantive dimensions of urban design thought: morphological, perceptual, social, visual, functional, and temporal, all embedded within 4 overarching contexts: global, local, market, and regulatory, that form the background against which urban design is practiced. As urban design is, or should be, a joined-up activity, and our experience of it certainly is an integrated one, this separation into dimensions and contexts could be seen as problematic. At the same time, to better understand the whole, and for the purposes of clarity in its exposition, it's first necessary to analyse the constituent parts. And this is what the different editions have always attempted to do. Whilst practices and theories have undoubtedly evolved alongside the explosion in published materials, this structure has been able to accommodate the changes and still remains at the core of the new book, albeit with new dimensions added and the context rationalised, as we will see. Feedback from users of the previous edition suggested, however, that what they valued above all were the dimensions chapters. These, they argued, helped them to make sense of the complex, overlapping, and sometimes confusing urban design literature. The new structure has therefore been refocused around these dimensions. Ultimately, of course, urban design can only be truly integrative if all areas of action are considered together, and this occurs, in theory at least, through the process of urban design. The first and second editions conceptualized a process of designing and separate delivery processes of development, namely private sector action, control or public sector action, and communication of those different actions. The new structure fully integrates the idea of urban design as a larger and ongoing place-shaping continuum, in which all of the dimensions, including the delivery processes, are fully immersed. These are now reconceptualized in two new process dimensions: design governance and place production. And the notion of urban design as a process runs like a golden thread throughout the book. Whilst these might crudely be seen as respectively the public sector's role in shaping the decision-making environment for urban design and the development processes through which private and public interventions in the built environment are made, it was important to broaden out and to internationalize previous discussions of these process dimensions. So the new process dimensions incorporate the notion that numerous actors, tools of engagement, and interacting in continuous processes are involved, not least the vital activity of understanding community aspirations and engaging communities directly in decision-making. Feeding into and informing these now 8 rather than 6 dimensions are now 3 rather than 4 overlapping, overarching and shifting contexts in which urban design action is situated. The local, the global, and the power contexts, each of which encompass 2 critical facets. Local context encompasses not only the distinctive qualities of local places in which urban design actions are situated, but also the cultural complexities and differences that shape the different responses to those different contexts. This cultural diversity is given a much greater prominence in the 3rd edition, as it should be in a world where ideas and people move much more freely and where cultural specificities are too easily ignored or undermined. The global context concerns not only the imperative to respond rapidly to twin climate and ecological emergencies, but also to the all-pervasive impact of technology on both the experience of urbanity as well as on the day-to-day practices of urban design. For example, the rise and use of big data. Both are externally imposed realities that are global in their origins, but profoundly local in their impacts. The power context brings together market and state power relations. Previously, these were conceptualized as separate contexts, although in reality, the tensions and synergies between them is what defines this power context in terms of how decision-making power is wielded and negotiated, and what its day-to-day impact is on the shaping of places. Within this structure, it's pertinent to ask, what is the new information that has informed the new edition, and what has remained the same over the decade or so since the last edition was published? Fundamentals of the discipline, what urban design aims to achieve, and the diverse ways it goes about it, have not significantly changed, albeit they continue to evolve within the changing local, global, and power context that I've already described. The new edition defines urban design as the process of better shaping, or rather the process of shaping better places for people than would otherwise be produced. In doing so, it recognises that with or without urban design, places will continue to be created. But urban design reflects a belief in the human potential to deliver better outcomes, if we so choose to do, by bringing to bear the collective wisdom held within the discipline. This definition, in one subtle but important way, differs from that which featured in the previous editions of the book, namely the substitution of the word making for shaping. Urban design is not about making new places from scratch as we would a consumer good, but instead is always about shaping places that already exist. These places may or may not already have been developed, but will always be on or over or sometimes under an existing landscape, which more often than not will be part of an existing urban fabric. In this regard, we shape and reshape places over time. So here, the site on the left, which is about to be developed and hasn't been developed before, already has trees on it and natural features and ecology, and is crisscrossed with drainage ditches that were dug to drain the land by the farmers that used to farm in this place. Just as if it had already had buildings on it, these form part of the site's context that should be considered as the site is developed, as the place, in other words, is reshaped. The neoliberal hegemony of market-state relations within which urban design typically operates has also remained largely the same over this last decade, interrupted and influenced, if perhaps not fundamentally changed, in the early 2010s by the financial crisis and the associated austerity that affected many countries, and latterly, of course, by the health and economic crises associated with COVID, the full impact of which remains as yet unknown. Whilst there have been repeated attempts to redefine the subject, for example, by relating it to particular favoured theories or redefining it within the disciplinary boundaries of allied subjects, as well as repeated attempts to package and market it under the guise of the latest urbanism, The major leap forward during this period can best be described in terms of a profound deepening of the knowledge base for the discipline. Taking each of the dimensions in the order in which they now appear in the book, it's possible to identify a range of subject matter that, whilst not new, has been significantly developed in the last decade and in the new edition of the book. Starting with the temporal dimension, or how time impacts on our experiences of places and how they are shaped through time, I would identify three key themes that have gained increasing prominence. First, expanding and shrinking cities. Whilst urban design literature is still dominated by discussions of managing growth, a lesser known but important body of knowledge and practice is dealing with the management of decline. Second, gentrification in design. Gentrification almost always raises its head when discussing urban design, but the relationship between the two, between design and gentrification, is often poorly understood. And third, resilience and temporality. The imperative to address climate change and its effects through the design of more resilient urban forms contrasts with the significant theorization and development of practices around the temporary city. So in each of these areas, like others that I've yet to mention, my goal is always to present the arguments and evidence in a manner in which tensions and possible resolutions become apparent. Moving to the perceptual dimension, encompassing the manner in which we perceive and relate to places, here I will emphasize two things. The question of what is authentic versus inauthentic has been tested by the massive spread in the fast developing regions of the world of what has been called simulacroscapes of a different order and scale to those experienced in the West, and in turn symbolizing the shift or the shifting production and consumption patterns of the globalized economy. Also, in a more global age, with cities competing against each other, certain buildings are increasingly designed to be immediately iconic. International architectural competitions are now routinely expected to generate iconic buildings. And sometimes we forget that it is places, not just buildings, that really make cities. Discussion of the morphological dimension relating to the physical structure of urban areas and spaces has been particularly strengthened in two areas. Informal urbanism has been a long-standing concern in the urban design literature from Christopher Alexander onwards, but these discussions have been significantly developed in recent years by a better understanding of the processes of urbanization in the global south. Street design also continues to evolve, with movements such as complete streets in the USA or arterials to boulevards in Australia demonstrating the value of well-designed streets that incorporate active travel opportunities and active edges. This is an old area of knowledge gaining new prominence through the need to retrofit many unsustainable cities. Turning to the visual dimension concerning the visual aesthetic experience of place, again, we can start with street design. From high-level walkways to waterfront promenades, typologies of streets are as diverse as those for public spaces. But have not always received the same academic attention, at least until recently. I would also pick out the ongoing debate on beauty and its importance. This is an ever-present part of the urban design canon, but debates have been reignited in recent years in the context of new evidence about the day-to-day impacts of beauty upon us and the inequitable access to beauty within society. On the social dimension, encompassing our complex social relationships with places, I would identify three new themes. First, public space narratives. Research around the use of and the right to public space represents some of the most active fields for urban scholarship, in which narratives of exclusion have long dominated, but are now being partly balanced, at least, by new and more positive attempts to re-theorize public space. Second, and perhaps not so positive, is the spread of urban design terror attacks and resulting military urbanism as the first design responses of many urban authorities. Finally, the pursuit of social justice has underpinned global debates around the role of urban design and urban management in overcoming exclusion born of cultural and ethnic diversity, sexual difference, gender identity, disability, and socioeconomic status. Here, the limits as well as the opportunities provided by urban design need to be fully understood. Regarding the functional dimension, or how places and their constituent parts function day to day, again, I would select three, not new, but strengthened themes born from recent trends. Perhaps more than any other, research on the linkages between health, well-being, and urban design has burgeoned over the last decade, requiring a significant focus in any disciplinary overview. In 2020, and of course still today, the COVID-19 pandemic has added a significant new focus to this concern. Second, building more explicitly urban areas at greater densities and how to manage this has been a major concern across the world, including the complications and contradictions of building high, and now notwithstanding the obvious tensions in a world dominated by its response to the current pandemic. Third, green and blue infrastructure, namely the need for the better integration of nature and green space into urban areas and the provision of quality and ecological richness alongside the quantity of such infrastructure delivered. Turning now to the first of the new process dimensions that I've already described, design governance, here I should highlight two critical themes. First, what we might call the culture of design. This reflects the latest European research that demonstrates that the most sophisticated public sector responses to achieving urban quality seek to embed the delivery of urban design in a local culture that routinely prioritizes place quality. They do this through, secondly, prioritizing the use of the right combination of both formal and informal tools of urban design governance. In this area, theories and practices of design governance have developed significantly, including work classifying and understanding the full range of formal and informal tools available to public authorities and others in order to better influence place production. The final dimension concerns place production. And here I would highlight first the real estate finance design intersection, from residual valuation to value engineering to land value capture and public-private partnerships. Design both alters the financial equation for development and is fundamentally affected by it. But this relationship is not well understood or exploited by urban designers. It relates second to the idea of place value. In particular, the exponential growth in scientific studies linking aspects of design quality with aspects of value, economic, social, environmental, and health, has led to the concept of place value, which has become a further underpinning concept throughout the book, including in this final chapter. Reflecting this growth in knowledge that I've described across all of the dimensions, and of course I've only highlighted a few themes, has inevitably meant that the new edition is itself far more reflective of a greater array of urban design thinking and experiences from around the world, including from fast developing and emerging nations and from the global south. Internationally, urban design is a rapidly growing discipline, and there is an ever increasing demand for urban design practitioners, or at least for those with place shaping sensibilities from both the public and private sectors. Whilst in Western countries this demand is variable but is long established, in recent years we've seen this same sensibility dramatically spread and grow in other parts of the world, with new teaching programs, journals and research and practice capabilities maturing very quickly. For me, the opportunity of writing a new edition has allowed me to better reflect my own thinking in the book, some of which I've already referred to in passing. The common thread uniting all of my own work has been the idea of urban design as a process, and and in particular that this process is at the heart of the discipline of urban design, rather than necessarily an agreed set of normative design principles. No single set of rules or objectives, I would argue, can capture the scope and complexity of urban design, nor offer a step-by-step formula for successful place shaping. Instead, it is an exploratory, intuitive, and deductive place shaping process involving engagement in complex, multifaceted, multi-stakeholder urban problems, embedded in the variable and specific conditions of time and place. The complex interactions between the varied and the varied variety of processes and the elements in place in any one location can, however, be examined, and these can give generic clues as to why some places succeed whilst others fail. It recalls the key question posed by Jane Jacobs, who famously sought to understand the kind of problem a city is. The book frames the increasingly extensive conceptual and interdisciplinary underpinning of the discipline in the hope that those who read it will bring a more informed, even enlightened perspective to bear on the production of urban space, shaping those better places for people than would otherwise be produced. So thank you for listening to this introduction. And if you have the opportunity, I hope you enjoy the book. I'm always pleased to receive feedback as the journey of urban design and public places, urban spaces within that I hope, will go on. But for now, very best wishes to you all.